Well, thank you so much to everyone for joining us for the third webinar in the NECAN Industry Webinar Series. So this series is designed to share information on how changes to coastal ecosystems, including ocean acidification, are affecting the aquaculture and fishing industries. Today, we'll hear from 3 different shellfish hatcheries, which have had experiences with impacts of ocean acidification on larval production. These talks will be coming from Alan Barton in Oregon, Bill Mook in Maine, and Mike Congrove in Virginia. Each of the 3 presentations will be 12 to 15 minutes with a joint question and answer session at the end of all 3 presentations. However, you can use the question box in the right panel, the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen to submit questions at any time during the presentations. If you do submit questions prior to the question and answer session, I just ask that you specify which speaker the question is for. So we will have an introduction to each panelist, or each presenter right before they present. So here is an introduction to our first presenter. Alan Barton is the production manager for Whiskey Creek Shellfish Hatchery in Netarts, Oregon, which is a major supplier of oyster larvae to shellfish farms throughout the Pacific Northwest. He's heavily involved in efforts to understand the effect of deteriorating water chemistry on production at the hatchery, and recently collaborated with OSU researchers to publish the first evidence linking ocean acidification to mortality of oyster larvae in naturally occurring seawater. Alan previously served as the project coordinator for the Pacific Coast Shellfish Growers Monitoring Program, which is a collaborative effort established between shellfish growers and members of the research community with the expressed goal of accurately monitoring seawater quality in areas important to commercial shellfish production. So thanks so much for speaking today, Alan. We will turn the screen over to your screen.
Okay, so today I'm just going to tell you a little bit of our story at Whiskey Creek over the last decade. I'm going to start out by talking about some of our efforts to monitor and collect data, and then move into some of the seawater treatment systems we've developed to deal with OA's impact on our hatchery and our industry at large. We have a pretty big industry in the Pacific Northwest. We support about 3,000 jobs in rural areas, and we contribute about $300 million to those rural areas. At Whiskey Creek, we're in our 41st year of production this year, so we've been around a while, been a big part of the industry for a long time. We're one of 3 major shellfish hatcheries in the region that supply larvae to growers. The other 2 hatcheries are part of big shellfish farms, so their primary goal is to produce larvae for themselves. So that means we're a very important supplier to all the other independent growers in the region. So when we started having trouble about a decade ago, it wasn't just a problem for the small staff at our hatchery. It was a problem for hundreds of people that depend on our product. Our oyster is a lot like the eastern oyster. It's a broadcast spawner, so I won't belabor the life cycle. So we were able to successfully eliminate these bacteria from our hatchery, but unable to restore production. So at that point, we started looking at what I call the list of usual suspects, our algae, our broodstock quality, and none of these things could be directly linked to the mortality we were seeing. Fortunately for us, we had a huge mortality event in July of 2008, which basically wiped out everything in the hatchery. I can say that was fortunate for us now because without any larvae in the tanks, we had a lot of free time, and we were able to start thinking about other causes of mortality. And this particular mortality event coincided with a huge upwelling event along the Oregon coast. And at that time, we shifted our focus to thinking about carbonate chemistry as the potential cause of our problems. So to look at that more closely, we started monitoring in 2009. We had maybe not the best instrumentation at the time, but we supplemented all of our data with discrete samples sent off to Burke Hale's lab at Oregon State, and that allowed us to get a pretty good data set. To collect these samples, you need empty beer bottles, and so that's where I really came into the fold. I was the official emptier, and allowed us to get a lot of samples out that year and get a pretty good data set. We eventually published that data, and essentially what it told us is that when we saw this corrosive upwell water we were not able to make money producing larvae in the hatchery. By 2010, we formalized our relationship with OSU. We also stole a guy from the East Coast over there. Dr. George Walbuster came on at OSU, and we've worked with him ever since, and he's been helping us to understand the mechanisms behind the mortality we've seen. George's lab has also come up with some pretty cool pictures. This picture you see on the right here is oyster larvae from the natural environment. So the top photo is larvae from Taylor Shellfish Hatchery in their shallow water, which almost always has a good pH, and the bottom photo is larvae from their deep water, which almost always has a very low pH. And even if you're not an expert on larvae, you can probably tell that the guys in the top photo are nice and symmetrical, and the ones on the bottom are in pretty bad shape and very unlikely to survive. So this is a pretty compelling sort of thing we could show people to show them that carbonate chemistry is today affecting larval shell formation in the natural environment. By 2010, we expanded our network to some other important growing areas, to Taylor's Hatchery up in Davao Bay, and some important growing areas in Willapa Bay as well. The idea here is that although OA is a big global problem, it turns out that oysters really could give a good jack crap about the global annual average pH of the ocean. Oysters live and reproduce in narrow regions along the coastline, and typically in summer months. So when we focused in on those regions and timeframes, we were able to tell a much different story about coastal acidification. In 2010, we also started working with the California Current Acidification Network. This was a really great forum for us to sit down with a lot of certified smart guys, a lot of researchers, leaders in the field, as well as government agencies and shellfish growers, to talk about what we thought we might want to monitor and to what degree of accuracy we wanted to monitor it. That eventually resulted in a core principles document that CCAN put out, which I would encourage anybody to look at if you're interested in monitoring. Sort of synthesizes all the things we went over in those discussions. It also allowed us to get in touch with IUs and learn ways to contribute this data online so that our growers could see it in real time. 2012, we participated. This was a great forum for us to not only continue funding for our monitoring efforts, but also allowed us to take some real actions on OA in our region. We established a native species hatchery in Washington State, and at the same time in Oregon, we were getting a lot of support from our state legislature, not only for our monitoring, but for the molluscan broodstock program and Dr. Chris Langdon and their efforts to breed oysters that may be resistant to ocean acidification. Fortunately for me, by 2013 and 2014, the big boys sort of stepped in and took over our monitoring program, which I was very thankful for. Since then, NOAA has expanded our monitoring network. We now have 15 sites in important shellfish growing areas from California up to Alaska. So it's been a good partnership for all of us. Unfortunately, I don't get paid for data collection. I get paid for putting larvae in boxes and shipping them out to growers. And so I thought I'd take some time to show how this data has helped us do just that. This is some older data from 2009, but I just wanted to show you that when we started getting real-time data, we learned a lot more than we expected to. And the first thing we learned is there's a lot more natural variability in our bay than we expected, and that we could take advantage of it. So we're not the smartest guys around, but we said, hey, you know, if the pH is high in our bay in the afternoon due to photosynthesis, why don't we use that water for spawning eggs in our most sensitive stages of larvae and see if it helps? And although that seems like a small decision now, it's actually the reason we're still in business. We were able to find some moments when we had good water quality, put our most sensitive larvae into that water and limp along the rim. You know, we were able to get a few groups through and make a little bit of money so we could stay open. Similarly, in a longer term sense, we learned that upwelling is driven by wind out of the north, and it takes a couple of days for that upwell water to move across the continental shelf and into our bay. So when we felt the wind blow out of the north, we grabbed every oyster we could find in the hatchery and spawn it, and try to get those eggs developed before that bad water reached us. So real-time data making us real-time, helping us make real-time money. Since then, we've developed buffering systems. We have a constant pH in the hatchery now. We don't need to buffer just in the summertime. Our pH is low year round, and so 365 days out of the year we're buffering our water. And when we did that, we eliminated what I call the direct effect on the initial shell development of oyster larvae. We don't have that problem anymore. Unfortunately, we continued to have late season mortalities where oyster larvae of all sizes were dying, and we now understand those are related to low oxygen events in our bay and out on the continental shelf. So we're literally on life support at the hatchery. We're constantly pumping oxygen in our water now. And the idea here is just to take some stressors off the table. We have a constant pH, constant oxygen saturation in the hatchery, and it's allowed us to have much more consistent production. Ultimately, what all this data collection has done for us is help us to think about our hatchery as part of a system. So we think about where these drivers of pH variability come from. We have local variability due to eelgrass photosynthesis in the bay. We have offshore influences from upwelling, and hanging over all of this, 400 part per million hairy-ass gorilla in the room, which is that there's a lot more CO2 in the atmosphere than there used to be, and it's causing a problem for our larvae, not just during the summer months, but year-round, and not just in upwelling regions like ours. Around the world, there's more CO2 in the atmosphere, lower pH in the ocean, and all shell-forming organisms are having at least some more difficulty than they used to have in the past. Similarly, we can look at where drivers of DO variability come from, and the idea here is by thinking about where these problems come from, we can better tailor our solutions in the hatchery. I think I'll skip that one since I lost some time. We're not done yet. We've got a lot more consistent production through tackling those two major big issues, but we're continuing to look at a lot of other things on our radar. Right now, we're thinking a lot about the types of algae that bloom each summer. The species that bloom on our coast now are starting to change as there's more CO2 in the water, and some of them are potentially not great for larvae in our hatchery. We're also looking at things called the hocus pocus part of all these parameters. We're looking at oxygen demand, changes in speciation of organic matter, and still looking at bacteria blooms, with the idea that if we collect enough data, we may be able to find some correlations between some parameter and blips in production in our hatchery. So we have really great partnerships that are doing that, and continuing to do some really good work and make progress on these issues. Ultimately, though, the cause of all this is fossil fuel emissions. So when I found this out years ago, I was pretty mad. I wanted to go out and shake my finger at the guys doing this, and I was pretty surprised to find out that we are one of the largest propane consumers in Tillamook County. Right, we're the bad guys. We're the ones shooting ourselves in the foot, including our atmosphere and ocean. But that has allowed us to speak to a much larger audience. We're not just sitting around a campfire, holding hands and singing Kumbaya and telling people what they shouldn't be doing. We're trying to produce. We need energy to produce, trying to run a business and make money. But we can get changes if we're going to continue to have a healthy ocean in which to do just that. We've been around for 150 years in our industry. We'd like to be around for 150 more, but there's a lot of work to be done if we're going to make that happen. So that's all I got. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alan. We are going to move on to Bill Mook's presentation. I also realized that I did not introduce myself at the beginning, so I apologize for that, and I'm going to briefly introduce myself. I'm Meredith White. I am chairing the NECAN Industry Working Group and have been working with that group to organize this webinar series, so excuse me for forgetting that. I also work with Bill Mook at Mook Sea Farm. So now Bill's introduction. Bill owns Mook Sea Farm, an oyster farm on the Damariscotta River, which he founded in 1985. This company raises oysters from egg to market size and also sells seed oysters to other East Coast growers. Bill is a member of the NECAN Steering Committee and served on Maine's Ocean Acidification Commission, which issued a report in 2014 summarizing the state of the ocean and coastal acidification science and recommended actions that Maine can take to address the threat posed by acidification to Maine's marine resources.
Okay. So we're located on the Damascus River in Mid-Coast, Maine. We've been in business for 33 years. It started up in 1985. We're a seed supplier. We provide, unlike Whiskey Creek, we do cultureless spat that we supply to growers from North Carolina to Maine. We're located in the mid-coast part of the state, probably about an hour east along the coast, northeast along the coast from Portland, as you can see in that locator map. If you zoom in on the Damascus River, you can see we've marked where our lease sites are. At the top of the screen on the left is the town of Damascus and Newcastle. Our two major growing leases are in the upper part of the river. Our hatchery is a few miles south of that. And then we have a winter lease site where we maintain market-ready oysters during the winter, so we have access to them so we can sell oysters year-round. The picture on the right is a wonderful aerial photograph that actually shows the whole estuary, and those sites are marked on there as well. So I'm going to start with talking a little bit about our larval production problems, and this happened slightly after all the travails that Alan went through on the Pacific Northwest, and we had a really bad year in 2009. We, at the time, it was a very, very wet year, and we attributed it to a lot of large rainstorms with a lot of runoff. We, on occasion saw no success after fertilization of the eggs, but more often we saw cessation of larval feeding, poor growth, protracted larval phases that could last 3 to, normally we would expect them to take 14 days or so to go through the larval phase, and we were seeing cohorts that would take 3 weeks, sometimes almost 4 weeks to go through. And I have to say a public thank you to Alan, because he came to the state of Maine very late in 2009 and related a lot of what he just talked about. Of course, there's been a lot more information developed since then, but he really put us on the track to trying to figure out what was going on and correct it. And the bottom line is that when we buffer our seawater, our larvae grow fast, our survival is high, and we get a very high conversion from the larvae to juvenile oysters. The real question that I'm going to start delving into a little bit here, that all of this drove us to try to answer, is what are the driving factors behind our problems? And of course, going to Alan's great slide with the gorilla, we have to start with the rapid increase of carbon dioxide since the Industrial Revolution, which is dissolving into the surface waters of our world oceans, and that certainly provides the backdrop. But as I'd mentioned, we really observed a lot of these problems occurring during big rain events, and sure enough, if you look at the average annual precipitation in Portland, you see it's about an inch increase in annual average precipitation every 11 years, and that's significant, I guess. But the big thing really is this. This is a kind of a great picture of what's going on with how the precipitation occurs, and it shows that the Northeast is pretty much a bullseye, and we've seen over the last 50 plus years a 71% increase in what are defined as very heavy precipitation events, which are really the heaviest 1% of rainstorms. And if you burrow in a little further and look at some more recent data, you see that the pattern for how the rain is falling is that we're seeing an increase in precipitation during the winter and spring, and in the autumn as well. And actually, we oftentimes tend to have very dry summers, and that actually may be why we're not seeing more problems with juvenile oysters after they've gone out of the hatchery. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But then there's a third thing that's going on, and we noticed this in our hatchery, where our filter bags, from when we first started the business in the 80s and all through the 90s, we got into the early 2000s, we started noticing that our filter bags weren't filling up very much. And it turns out that a scientist named Barney Balch at Bigelow Labs has shown that there's a 5-fold decrease in primary productivity, and he showed that it was linked to an increase in color dissolved organic matter, which is basically associated with runoff. It's basically, if you think of what happens when you have water draining out of a swamp and running through fallen leaves, it's that tea color that makes its way into the Gulf of Maine and has essentially changed the color of the Gulf of Maine. It happens to absorb light in the same wavelengths that many of the phytoplankton do, and therefore has reduced the primary productivity. It's really not clear to us that mechanism is all that's going on in the nearshore waters. There's some researchers at the University of Maine who think that there may be some other things going on as well, but nonetheless, it has a great deal of bearing on what we think is going on in terms of carbonate chemistry. But I have to say, it is not shown in this graph. So this is a graph that shows the saturation state for aragonite, which is the form of calcium carbonate that oyster larvae make their shells from. The red line is the actual data gathered during the growing season, April 15th to October 15th. I think that was 2015, yes. And the straight black line at about 1.6, that is thought to be and I think some research has shown that that's basically a threshold below which oyster larvae don't do very well. And above that, they seem to be able to grow and survive okay. And what we did, just to kind of take a guess at what the carbonate chemistry might have been like when we started the business, is we made the assumption based on some data from Dr. Joe Salisbury at UNH. He had a 10-year-long data set that showed about a 1.2 part per million increase per year of carbon dioxide in the surface waters. And then we know that our salinity has declined over all these years, and it's about at least a 2 part per thousand decrease in salinity. What we did not account for in this when we transformed the data was any information about primary production. So I really feel that blue line at the top, which is kind of a guess at what the conditions might have been like when we started the business, if anything, I think that line should be a little bit higher at many key times, because of in those days we did have more intense and more frequent phytoplankton blooms. Let's see. So all of this really brings up, we feel like our problem is solved in the hatchery. When we do the buffering, it literally was like turning a light switch on for us anyway. And we have very regular production. Basically every cohort goes through in about 14 days, and it allows us to have very dependable spat production because of that. And that certainly wasn't the case at any point for, or at least a long time before 2014, when we started regularly doing this buffering. But the real question is, what happens when we can control the water chemistry in the hatchery, and Alan certainly talked about that too, but what happens when you take these young post-set oysters and put them out into the natural environment? And there is some evidence, and this is a paper, Talmadge and Gobler in 2011, where this is a benchtop study where they manipulated the carbon dioxide levels in the water, and they used 400 parts per million as a control, 1,700 parts per million PCO2 for the experimental treatment, and they showed that over 6.5 weeks that there was there was significantly less calcification in the higher PCO2 group. And they concluded that juveniles, however, are not as vulnerable as larvae. Couple comments I would make is that 1,700 parts per million is very high. We don't see PCO2s that high in our incoming water. I believe, and Meredith can back me up on this later, but I think it's about 950 parts per million that we see as kind of the high level. However, that we do see omega levels that are comparable to the ones that they had in their study. It's maybe not quite down to 1.4, but just a little bit above that for calcite. The other thing is that the calcification rate seems very low for the control. We did do some calcification studies a couple summers ago and measured over about a 6-week period 21.5 milligrams per day for similar size seed during that growing season. And I think all of this really points out, and so these are the areas that we feel research should be heading for us here, at least on the East Coast. And we think it's really important that we start doing some field-based studies to ask the question whether or not we really are having an impact from changing carbonate chemistry in our field grow-out systems, and whether we should be thinking about doing something about it. We need to know what the impact of ocean acidification is on juvenile calcification rates. We need to try to identify some thresholds so we can begin to get a grip on when we might hit some tipping points. And you know, the question I would ask is, what are we looking to try to measure? Do we want to look at just simply growth rate survival, you know, shell strength? Are we going to is one indicator that we're having trouble going to be that chefs at all the restaurants we're sending our oysters to call back and complain that their shells are breaking rapidly whenever they're trying to shuck them? And really, what are the best indicators? You know, is it PCO2? Is it pH? Is it omega? And then I think there's a lot of work that needs to go on in genetics. And then I think based on what we find out with the current impacts of this on juvenile calcification rates and whether it is in fact hurting us now, I think then we begin to look at what the adaptation technologies might be appropriate. So that's all I had, and I'll turn it back to you, Meredith, so you can introduce Mike. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Bill. So anyone who didn't know, that was a picture of me on the last slide. Mike Congrove is the owner and operator of Oyster Seed Holdings, an oyster hatchery in Matthews, Virginia, on the western shore of the Chesapeake Bay. Oyster Seed Holdings supplies oyster larvae and small seed to farms in the Chesapeake Bay and Mid-Atlantic region. Mike received a BS in biology from Old Dominion University and an MS in fisheries science from the Virginia Institute of Marine Science. Thanks, Mike.
Okay, and thank you for having me. A borderline southerner up in NECAN region. So this is my humble little hatchery in Matthews County. Kind of a combination of Alan's hatchery and Bill's hatchery in that we both produce larvae and seed. So in Virginia and Chesapeake Bay region, there's a market for spat-on-shell production or eyed larvae for spat-on-shell production. So we produce in part larvae and also in part single seed that would go into more intensive type culture. So just a little perspective. I think spatial perspective is important. You can see Whiskey Creek on the west coast and Mook Sea Farms on the east coast. And us, you know, those guys are at pretty similar latitude. We're quite a bit south of them. We are in a big estuary. The Chesapeake Bay is one of the biggest estuaries in the world. And if you compare it to the two environments of the two previous hatcheries that were just discussed, it's huge, frankly. And it's also, whereas these other two estuaries are kind of near coastal, small bays, we're in more of like an upper estuarine environment, pretty far from the bay, or I'm sorry, pretty far from the ocean, and relatively insulated from the ocean. Because of that, we have a relatively wide range of a lot of different parameters. So at our site, that panel in the middle, the arrow there is pointing at our site in Chesapeake Bay. Our salinity ranges anywhere from 10 to 20 parts per thousand through a season. We see a temperature range of maybe -2 to like +32 centigrade. Not always that high, but it does happen. And then a pH range of really a whole pH point, something from 8.2, 8.3 to 7.2, 7.3. You know, kind of 8 in the 8.3 range at the beginning of our season, and by later summer we're down pretty low, in the low 7s. And it's also being an upper estuarine environment, its main driver of acidification processes is eutrophication, and so it's very highly biologic in the I guess the mechanisms that are contributing to acidification, and not so much from upwelling events on the West Coast or ocean-related water on the East Coast. Although I know you know, Bill deals a lot with freshwater as well. So I put this in just to give you an idea of, so Virginia's dependence on hatchery production has increased dramatically in the last 10 years or so. We're relatively new to the game with the exception of clam production, which has been going on quite a bit longer. But you can, well, I'll get to that in a second. I'll just say here that now we're looking at a farm gate value of about $53 million. That was 2017, and so we do have a lot to lose here by losing this hatchery production that's been built over the last decade or so. I thought I'd talk about us specifically to cite inconsistency in production, and I'll back up just for 1 second. So starting in 2010 is where we really started to see a lot of new hatcheries coming online and a lot of increased production. You'll see that those numbers are a little bit variable. And if I had to guess, I would say that you know, everybody's individual numbers are something similar to what we see at our hatchery, and just that because of the massive increase in everybody's infrastructure, we've kind of maintained this stepwise increase over time as an industry on a whole. But from our perspective, this is our 10th year in operation. Again, I have our larvae production in green bars and our seed production in blue bars. Our seed production has increased relatively consistently over time, and we can maintain that seed production relatively consistently. But it's our larvae that really suffers, and anytime that we run into larvae production problems, we really hold that larvae in-house, set seed with it so we can fulfill our seed orders, or at least come as close to that as possible. And it really limits the amount of larvae that's available to that larvae or spat on shell market. And I dropped that arrow in place because 2014 is really the point that we started to see a big change. Whereas we'd had some variability before. I mean, if you take 2009 out, that was our first year. 2011 was a big drop, and the other 3 years were pretty reasonable. And we were pretty satisfied with that. From 2014 on, some of the reduction in larvae production can be explained by setting more seed. We're constantly kind of increasing our seed market. So that's a little bit of it, but it doesn't explain all of that difference. And what we saw starting in 2014 was a consistent reduction in survival from egg to harvest, basically. So in a hatchery that normally was seeing cultures that would survive from egg to ready to set larvae at a range of like 20 to 30%, from 2014 on, it was much closer to a range of like 10 to 20%. So pretty big difference, which really limited the amount of larvae we're able to produce in a season. And so we get to thinking about water quality as a whole, and I see it as this puzzle. And so we're going to set carbonate chemistry aside for a minute because we're gonna come back to that. But temp, DO, and salinity, the middle school water quality parameters, we have a pretty good idea about how larvae tolerate those. We've started looking at nutrient chemistry, and it's actually been really interesting. We found that in the bay we have issues with ammonia. Not at levels that any of the literature would suggest are a problem for oysters. They're really tolerant of high ammonia levels, larvae as well, but it turns out that embryogenesis is not. And so if we're having prolonged periods of high ammonia in the water, we can have failures in embryogenesis, basically just starts of spawns. plankton community, read that as HABs. We have trouble from time to time with these, and we're trying to better understand, you know, what role they play and what toxicity they can exhibit on our larvae. Pollution, whether it's, and I kind of group pesticides and insecticides, fluorocarbons, all kinds of things like that that get dissolved in the water as pollutant type problems, and then bacteria fauna, Vibrio, other pathogenic bacteria that can be a problem in larvae culture. And so the idea is to be able to piece all these puzzles together, right? So we have billions of billions of these really robust, you know, consistent larvae cultures. But how does a private company with relatively, you know, limited resources do this? And I think it's pretty obvious from hearing the other two talks is that you don't do it by yourself. So it requires a lot of different people and a lot of academic and public support to do it. We have a lot of that through VIM's Seed Grant, thanks to Karen Hudson and several different labs at VIMS, but Karen Hudson does a lot of oversight, and Dave Kuhn of Virginia Tech provides a lot of oversight and has done a lot of grant writing to help get some of the things done that we've started in the last few years. We've also had support of Joe Salisbury at UNH for PCO2 monitoring. VMRC, CZM, NOAA, Sustainable Fisheries have all supported these projects in various different ways. And then we have a good kind of loose consortium of private hatcheries, basically. H&M Terry, Cherrystone, JC Walker, Ward, Bevins and Cowart through their hatchery KCB, and Oyster Seed Holdings. And so this is just a brief outline of what we've done kind of since 2011. That was really just kind of a workshop to get everybody on the same page of what was going on and what could be a problem in the Bay region. 10 to 12, we got set up with some wet labs to do water quality parameters with fluorometers. 2013 and 15, we got our first PCO2 monitor in the Bay at the KCB hatchery up on the Potomac River. And the SK grant in 15 to 18 increased that to 2 more LICOR PCO2 sites, and also looking at much cheaper immersion CO2 sensors to see if we could approximate aragonite saturation rates using that type of equipment, which is a lot cheaper than having to operate a LICOR style PCO2 monitor or system. These are the sites where we've been doing this. The 3 Ls are the LICOR sites. So the one up on the Potomac River at the very top, Oyster Seed Holdings site, the one straight down below it, and then off to the right on the eastern shore is a Cherrystone site. We have the LICOR, and then all the hatcheries also have the cheaper immersion CO2 sensor as well. So getting back to carbonate chemistry, and I'll talk about, just because we're a little bit new to this, kind of some preliminary data and what we've seen so far, try and maybe scratch our heads a little bit and try and make a little bit of sense out of that. But just giving an idea of the system we're using, again, it is the UNH PCO2 monitor, and then just the carbon dioxide sensors down on the bottom left that we're using to compare with. And I don't have that data yet, unfortunately, but it seemed like they were doing relatively well. And from just from a hatchery operator's perspective, it may be a data set that's good enough to kind of manage from rather than having to keep up with a PCO2 monitor. So this is data from 2016. It's showing aragonite saturation in blue. And then I've put some kind of hatchery performance metrics on there with it. The orange dots are harvest rate, which for us is basically survival from egg to harvested larvae or ready to set larvae. And then the green dots are hatch rate, which is essentially just survival from egg to 2-day-old larvae or dehinged larvae. I've put them on the plot with the aragonite saturation kind of through time, just using a multiplier, just to kind of give you an idea of how it relates to that aragonite line. One thing I'll point out is that those orange dots should, in kind of a normal performing time, should be grouped between the 1 and 0.5 lines. That's about 10 to 20% survival. And then the green dots should be kind of right along that 1 line, maybe just below it. Our typical survival for hatch rate is about 45%. And so putting those 2 indicators into scatter plots below, you'll see that there's not a whole lot of relationship between these. And just looking at it visually on the aragonite saturation plot, it doesn't seem to track very closely. And so that's one of the things I wanted to point out, was just that we haven't seen a really tight coupling with the kind of performance metrics that we're trying to use and the aragonite saturation data that we're recording. I'll also point out that that dotted line on the top graph is the 1.7 kind of threshold that Alan et al. has suggested is necessary kind of for, I guess, profitable production in a Giygas hatchery. And I'll go ahead and move to 2017, which shows a similar picture, and keep talking about that. Apparently, oh, there it is. You know, this year was even recorded a little bit lower, and so I think, and whereas it's not great production that we've had these last couple of years, it's decent. And I think that it's possible that there's a very different threshold for Virginica than there is for Giygas. Virginica is more of an estuarine species. I mean, biologically, maybe that makes some sense. Again, we had in this year we had even less kind of coupling of those hatchery performance measures to the aragonite line. So I think basically what it says is that I think aragonite saturation is important. It doesn't seem to be as important in the bay for us yet. I think we have a whole lot of other problems that we need to address, and just given the environment, or the type of environment that the bay is, I think you can make an argument for that. So I'll back up just a little bit. I forgot to mention that this year, in 2016, we did buffer all our water. Our hatchery runs kind of a hybrid system in that we run static culture from day 0 to 6, then we run continuous culture. That is flow through larvae culture from day basically 6 to the end of the larval phase. That makes it a little bit trickier to monitor, or I'm sorry, to regulate pH. But we basically did it with continuous monitors and a pH dose, or a carbonate dosing system. And we really didn't see any improvement to speak of from doing that, even maintaining a pH of around 8.2, 8.3 in saturation state, as we were aragonite saturation, as we were recording it anyway, of around 1.8. And so the next steps, I think, in Virginia are to obviously complete and wrap up this SK project that we've been working on, continue to refine our PCO2 and possibly CO2 data collection and processing, establish an aragonite omega break-even threshold. Again, that's the Barton et al. kind of threshold that I think we don't really have yet for Virginica. And then to consider some new metrics for evaluating hatchery performance to see if we can get something that would, I don't know, maybe be more indicative of how that hatchery is performing relative to aragonite saturation. And with that, I guess we'll move on to questions, Meredith.
Yes, thanks so much, Mike.
Sure.
Okay, so great, thank you. So Emily has just shared the questions with me so that I can lead this question and answer session. Okay. So our first question is for Alan, and this is from Scott Lindell. How has pH monitoring of growing areas, 15 areas monitored now, how has this helped production? I understand how it helps in the hatchery where you can manage it.
Well, I guess it, you know, in grow out areas, it hasn't necessarily. A lot of our learning curve for us is getting growers who are setting larvae to pay attention to water chemistry. You know, so getting that data available to them and seeing what's coming at them is hopefully, educating them that, hey, there's some really bad times here that I should avoid. Some of our growers are doing that, not all of them.
Okay, thank you. For also
variability. So yeah, we're not there yet, but getting people to think about pH is hopefully getting us toward that goal.
great, thank you. Also for Alan, also from Scotland Dell, what sort of buffers do you use for continuous application?
Sodium carbonate is, soda ash. We get 50-pound bags from the feed store. I guess it's used commonly in agriculture. I'm not sure why, but anyway, soda ash is what we use. I should point out that we ignore the other side of the equation, the saturation state equation. There's two things that change. One is carbonate and ion, and the other is calcium ion. Well, we're very high salinity, so we kind of ignore the calcium side of things, except every once in a while we have the Columbia River come down to our site, and we've had periods of time where we've added, huge amounts of calcium to the water to try to get our saturation states back up. But for the most part, we're fairly stable salinity and ignore that part of it.
Great. So actually,
what were those lows?
Low for us is 21, 20.
Okay, so that leads into the next question, which is for Alan and others. So Scott asks, what is the targeted aragonite saturation level, and can pH monitoring and controllers be a safe proxy?
This is Bill here. I can answer that for us. We don't use, we don't calculate the omega levels. We only use pH, and we use fairly inexpensive pH controllers and also just handheld pH meters.
This is Mike. So that's what we were doing as well. We were checking it with our our PCO2 system has two different equilibrators. We can read an ambient water PCO2 and read basically a post filtration PCO2 number. And so we were using a pH meter to control, but we're also reading PCO2 in that water immediately coming after, kind of downstream of the buffer input.
Yeah, our pH set point, our carbonate injection is controlled by pH because that's what's available. But yeah, 8.2-ish is where we go for. But we got two different species of oysters here we're talking about. When we've had salinities down and around the 20 and buffered 8.2, we get egg development, but we had been dissatisfied with our small larvae, and that's why we added calcium as well in those periods to get the saturation state up higher. And so these are, up above, certainly up above 2 saturation states, up above 2 that we prefer, but I think Mike was right in the comment, that we got two different oysters here, one that's probably more suited for lower salinities and estuary environments.
So this next question is coming from me. Alan, with the expansion of monitoring, who has funded the maintenance of these additional Berkelator monitors after the initial purchase? And is there a plan for continued maintenance and calibration for this equipment?
The plan is to beg for more money. No, our state funds our monitoring. I've never been a big believer in government until I met these guys, and we know these guys pretty well. They like us, and so Whiskey Creek is funded independently now by our own state. NOAA is providing a lot of the funding for these other sites, and they're doing a really good job of working together with the growers and understanding people's limitations, and working with everybody to get good data from these locations.
Okay, so that is the end of the questions that we have received so far. But if any, we'll stay on for a few more minutes since we have time and see if anyone else submits questions. Do any of the panelists have questions for each other?
Alan, this is Mike. I have a quick one. What source of calcium do you guys use when you do add calcium?
Calcium chloride, and again, we go for on that, you know, just like 50-pound bags of just like for brine, you know, for brine solution, you can get it pretty cheap. But we rarely do that. But yeah, that's something, you know, in lower salinity I think would be worth a shot, you know.
It's something to think about for sure.
And we have a question from Beth Turner at NOAA. It's nice to hear that NOAA's helping out. What do you wish that NOAA was doing that they are not doing now?
I'm not sure I can make an answer that won't get me in trouble. Technical support. Technical support is key for these instruments. You know, you can put a percolator in somewhere, but we just scratch our head and look at all the tubes and not sure what we're supposed to do with it. So that's always an issue. They've done a really good job, but yeah, there's always more need for you know, keeping these sensors online, and there's just not enough technicians to go around. So that's always been the drum I used to beat about all this, is like, well, who's going to come fix it? So.
This is Bill Mook. I would ditto that. I think, and Beth, you've heard me talk about this before, but I get frustrated because there are lots of money for infrastructure and they consider that to be just equipment, but it really needs to include people to keep it calibrated and make sure that the data is high quality. The other thing I'll just quickly say is I think there needs to be more effort put on field studies in addition to or instead of a lot of the benchtop studies to take into account more variables and seeing what's happening in you know the environments where we're growing these shellfish.
Just a plug for George Wallbuster. So he's got some funding to do some work with small seed and develop some tools for growers. So basically, like, it's a fluorescent dye that you can stain seed that's set on your culch and see how healthy it is, see what the lipid content of it is, and you know, getting people to use those is a learning curve, but developing those tools to go beyond the larval stage and get out in the field and help people realize, hey, we need to think about, you know, what is the water chemistry in our tank, what's the oxygen saturation in our setting tank. Those guys have been a big help in trying to push that forward, you know, because it doesn't stop at the hatchery, obviously.
Okay, and then another question from Scott Lindell. In reference to adding buffer, has anyone tested the limits of aragonite saturation? Could there be too much of a good thing?
Oh yeah, I killed a whole bunch of them. Yeah, it's pretty high though. You can go up to 4, and you know, I'll tell you a secret, we didn't come up with any of this stuff. The guys that grow corals do this stuff and have we just sort of looked at their thresholds. You know, they go pretty high on the saturation state for getting corals to propagate quicker, you know, and so there's some literature out there on that to look at.
So thank you to everyone who joined the webinar today, and thank you in particular to Alan and Bill and Mike, our 3 presenters. This was very informative, and this webinar will be posted to the NECAN website so other people can watch it in the future. And I think with that, we are ready to conclude. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.